What happens when a human being becomes a spectacle? In the early 1800s, crowds gathered in London and Paris not for a play or a concert, but to gawk at a young African woman placed in a cage. They called her the Hottentot Venus. Her real name was Sarah Baartman. She was stripped of her dignity, examined, objectified, and used as proof of a pseudo-scientific lie that black people were subhuman. But Sarah was not just a victim, she was a woman, a daughter of the Khoi-Khoi people of South Africa, born into a world of colonial oppression and racial violence. This video traces the life of Sarah Baartman from her childhood in the Eastern Cape to her final days in Paris. We will explore the colonial system that commodified her, the European obsession with her body, and the long fight to return her remains to her homeland. Through her story, we reflect on the violence of spectacle, the legacy of scientific racism, and the ongoing battle for dignity in the face of dehumanization. She was paraded as a curiosity, studied as a specimen, and displayed as a symbol of difference. But Sarah Baartman was never just a body, she was a life. And this is her story. In the early 19th century, in the plains of the Eastern Cape of South Africa, a young Khoi-Khoi woman named Sarah Baartman was born. Her birth name was likely Sarchi, though history would erase it in favor of one more palatable to the European tongue, Sara. She was born around 1789 into a Khoi-Khoi community, one of Southern Africa's oldest indigenous groups. Her childhood was shaped by colonization, war, and the violent encroachment of Dutch settlers, who had already begun the systematic destruction of her people's way of life. Her early years were marked by instability. As the Dutch and British fought for control over the Cape Colony, indigenous populations were caught in the crossfire. Orphaned young and taken in by Dutch settlers, Sarah was forced to labor on colonial farms. It was here that she came into contact with a man whose name would change the trajectory of her life forever. Pieter Willem Cesar, a Dutch farmer who would later play a role in her contractual enslavement. By 1810, Sarah had been taken to Cape Town, where she worked in domestic service. It was here that she came under the influence of Hendrik Cesar, Pieter's brother, and Alexander Dunlop, a Scottish military surgeon. These two men claimed they would take Sarah to Europe under the pretense of fame and fortune. Dunlop crafted a contract, allegedly signed by Baartman, though it's doubtful she understood it, if she signed it at all. It promised 12 years of exhibitions in return for wealth and eventual return home. In reality, it marked the beginning of years of exploitation. What made Sarah Baartman a spectacle in the eyes of European society was her body. More specifically, her steatopedia, a condition characterized by large deposits of fat on the buttocks, common among Khoi-Khoi women. To Western eyes, her figure was exaggerated, exotic, and hypersexualized. She was not seen as human, but as something between woman and specimen. She was renamed the Hottentot Venus, a title steeped in colonial and racial derision. The term Hottentot was a Dutch slur used to describe Khoi-Khoi people, and Venus, ironically, evoked the Roman goddess of love and beauty, twisting the image of black womanhood into something grotesque for white amusement. Upon arrival in London in 1810, Sarah was paraded as a curiosity. She was displayed in sideshows and circuses, standing on podiums or in cages, often in tight clothing or body stockings to accentuate her form. People paid to touch her, to ogle, to mock. She was often poked with sticks, jeered at, and treated as less than human. The exhibition was framed as scientific and entertaining. But make no mistake, it was dehumanizing. In a time where colonial science sought to classify humans into hierarchies of race and intelligence, Sarah Baartman became a living specimen in the so-called study of racial difference. Her displays were part of a broader trend of human zoos and ethnological exhibitions popular in 19th century Europe. Black and brown people were shown in cages like animals, proving European superiority through degrading spectacle. Sarah's exploitation was not just social but academic. Scientists and anthropologists attended her shows, measuring her body, photographing her, etching her form in scientific journals. Public outcry eventually erupted in Britain. Anti-slavery and human rights activists, most notably the African abolitionist Zachary Macaulay and members of the African Institution, protested Sarah's treatment. In November 1810, her case was brought before the British courts. The case sparked heated debates. Was Sara a willing participant or a victim of coercion? The courts, tragically, sided with her exhibitors. They accepted her supposed consent as evidence of her free will, even though she had no legal agency, no interpreter, and no family to advocate for her. But the damage was done. In Britain, she was paraded for 5 years. Her so-called contract never brought her wealth or dignity. Instead, she was an impoverished figure, trapped in a cycle of abuse, masked as performance. In 1814, she was taken to Paris. There, her circumstances worsened. She was sold to an animal trainer named S. Rowe, who continued to exhibit her in more degrading settings, this time alongside animals. Her condition deteriorated. In Paris, she was also introduced to the French scientific community, most notably Georges Cuvier, a zoologist and anatomist who would ultimately play one of the most grotesque roles in her story. Cuvier, hailed as the father of paleontology, saw Baartman not as a person, but as a scientific opportunity. After her death on December 29, 1815, at just 26 years old, Cuvier dissected her body. Without consent, without dignity, he studied her genitals, skull, and buttocks, declaring her an evolutionary link between apes and humans, a perverse validation of racial pseudoscience. He preserved her skeleton, brain, and genitalia in jars. Her casted body was placed on display at the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. For over 150 years, Sarah Baartman's remains were exhibited as a scientific specimen, a grotesque symbol of colonial conquest and racial exploitation. She died far from home, alone. And yet, even in death, she was not free. She remained in pieces, dissected and displayed, long after her body should have been laid to rest. But history has a strange way of remembering. In the late 20th century, Sarah Baartman became a symbol of resistance and remembrance. As the anti-apartheid movement gained traction in South Africa, so too did calls for her repatriation. She became a focal point in conversations about colonialism, black womanhood, sexual exploitation, and racial science. The push to bring her home began earnestly in the 1990s. One of the key figures in this movement was Nelson Mandela, who, after becoming South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994, formally requested the return of Sarah Baartman's remains from France. The French government initially resisted, citing scientific importance and national heritage. But pressure mounted. Historians, activists, and the South African government argued that she was not a scientific artifact. She was a stolen woman who deserved a dignified burial. In 2002, nearly 2 centuries after she was first taken from her homeland, Sarah Baartman finally returned to South Africa. Her remains were flown to Cape Town and then transported to Hankie in the Eastern Cape, close to where she was born. On August 9, 2002, National Women's Day, Sarah Baartman was laid to rest. The ceremony was solemn, powerful, and long overdue. She was buried on a hill overlooking the Gamtoos Valley, a site chosen for its significance to her people. At last, Sarah Baartman had come home. In her eulogy, then-President Thabo Mbeki reflected on what her story meant, not just to South Africa, but to the world. He said, "Her story is the story of the African people. It is the story of loss of freedom, of the stripping away of dignity, but it is also the story of our refusal to be forgotten." Sarah Baartman's life and afterlife raised difficult questions. Questions about power, consent, race, gender, and science. Her body became a battlefield upon which the West imposed its myths, fantasies, and fears about the black female form. Her treatment illustrated the brutal intersections of patriarchy, racism, and colonialism. But her legacy also became a point of reckoning. Today, Sarah Baartman's name is invoked in discussions about representation, sexualization of black women, and the long history of colonial violence. She is remembered in poetry, art, academia, and song. Sarah Baartman, as she is sometimes affectionately called in Afrikaans, has become both a person and a symbol. A symbol of what was taken, but also of what has been reclaimed. Her life reminds us of the dangers of dehumanization, of seeing people as objects of curiosity or tools of science. In her memory, institutions have begun to confront their pasts. The Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle removed her remains from display. Universities and museums now face growing calls to repatriate remains and artifacts looted during colonialism. And South African institutions continue to elevate her story, not just in mourning, but in resistance. Sarah Baartman, never consented to her journey. She never saw the wealth she was promised. But in her story, she forced the world to confront its ugliness. She forced the world to remember.